Yeah, I mean, for the time being, I just want to keep the focus on distance learning and the long-standing perception that it was somehow secondary in quality to face-to-face learning. And my fascination with distance learning began because I realised that there were huge advantages in writers engaging with a form of pedagogy that involved writing at every level. And in fact, there are real problems with face-to-face learning. I'm talking to you now, but you're all daydreaming, your attention span is limited, and only Nigel, my eyeball, you'd be really paying attention. So there are problems with the human dynamic of face-to-face teaching, which are often overlooked. And it seemed to me what was extraordinary about what began as epistolary exchanges in writing between students, and then became a much more exciting form, which was to exchange on the web itself, was the immersion of the whole pedagogic process in the dynamic of reading and writing. And the tutors and students exchange roles as readers and writers throughout the process. So when we moved from hard copy exchange, it seemed to me to get over the tyranny of typography. One of the great problems with creative writing teaching is to intervene in a student's work because it seems somehow finished, in the way that the sketch of a fine art student isn't quite finished. And having worked with visual artists and seen the way that they were able to intervene in a student's work, and the way that in a sense mistakes were buried and integrated into the texture of a drawing, it was hugely liberating, I think, as Nigel's pointed out, to be able to work with a student when the text remained ductile. So text exchanged in electronic form, and the way we've worked at Lancaster has been a very student-centred approach, where a professional writer who works as a tutor has individually worked with a student writer. They've built up between them a series of electronic exchanges which involve structured reports that are very closely observed protocols. And as well as having the creative process at the heart, there's also a discourse, a wider discourse, that encapsulates that creative work. So these are, in a simple way, maybe problems that students have with a piece of work, questions they may have about reading, aspects of technique they may have struggled with, and then the core work itself. And the responses, the structured responses of tutors that were made to those focused on both those things, so they might pick up those wider questions. Well, then they could go into the creative work itself, and they could do things to it. And it's really difficult to do that in a face-to-face situation, in a workshop or in a seminar, because of the constraints on time, but because of the kind of immobility of the text. So, to put it simply, e-learning allows us to show, not tell. We can take a poem and reset the lineation to show a student how we might do it. We can reset dialogue, we can edit the work and remove extraneous language from it, we can add language to it, we can play with the text, as Nigel said, and make it into a ductile element in the cross-communication. And as Paul Verlaine said, a poem is never finished, just set aside. And in a sense, the insistence for me on the redrafting process was enabled through this process of electronic exchange. So the first thing for me was a profound advantage in the whole business of distance learning. And in an academy where I emailed a colleague next door to me, the whole idea of distance is also wiped away. And it made no difference whether I was exchanging with a student in Kampala or a student in Lancaster. In a sense, temporal and spatial considerations are wiped away at a keystroke. And that's exciting as well, to be able to connect in an extraordinary way. As the kind of MA at Lancaster was kind of gradually reshaped when I came there, I tried to make it leaner and more economical. We introduced online conference processes. We created resources online like What I'm Reading, so students could write short reviews of books. So the learning is centred on the material the student generates. We don't have a curriculum, we don't have a set of modules that we teach. Our starting point is the students' work on which we work. And the students we get are extraordinary, mainly mature students, many of them experts in their own field. So, you know, farmers, teachers, accountants, serial adulterers, people that bring things to the course from life itself, you know, and which we work with. But that expertise is vital. So, again, just picking up one of Nigel's points about the democratic nature of creative writing and teaching, I think it becomes even more of a process through this exchange where we don't actually necessarily meet our tutor. And then I became interested in the resonance that the process has for us. The tutors are writing reports, students are writing works, tutors are rewriting students' work and actually working on it. We're all reading each other's work, and through the acts of reading, imagining that work. So it seems to me that one of the kind of inhibitions people have about this process is the romantic notion that technology sometimes somehow gets in the way of imagination. We've got reason here, we've got imagination over here. But it seems to me that every act that involves writing and textual exchange is an act of imagination. So right at the heart of this textual exchange are these interlocking imaginative acts. And one of them is a very profound one, which is imagining the tutor and the student. So when I turned up on residential courses, I've always been a lot smaller than people thought I would be. Probably a lot less beguiling. But I was interested in the way, stopping short of avatars, that we could be different in those exchanges, or we're perceived as different. We're literally read by our students as a different kind of human being. So the whole process for me is about literature, is about the kinds of imaginative exchanges that text can bring about, but embedded as well in the learning process. The change that began to come about at Lancaster was partly a frustration with the isolation of the university. Its geographical isolation means that we get very few black British students. The curriculum, I have to say as well that creative writing 20 years ago broke away from the English department, an act of insurrection. And just before I went there, we were put back into the English department, which was a bit like reuniting Mozambique with Portugal, and expecting that somehow to be okay. And there are profound ideological differences, I think, between the two disciplines, especially a discipline that we insist on being so student-centred at the postgraduate level. It's true to say as well that the English department is a very traditional department, locked in periodicity, and largely indifferent to the idea that we may teach, if not hostile, to the idea that we may teach through new technologies. And indeed, colleagues in the creative writing unit themselves have had some difficulty with this process, because after all, you have to surrender quite a bit of your own creative energy to the process. So before you find it exciting and stimulating as a writer, which I do, you also find it draining and demanding. And that's why our distance learning MA is taught by people off the campus that aren't actually immersed in this process of face-to-face teaching. And what that enabled us to create was a virtual department. So we have the actual department where I meet colleagues, or don't meet them, I actually email them in just the same way that I email the offshore people. And we have a virtual department, which is made of 0.25 appointments, professional writers who spend part of the time working from their home environment to interact with their students. What the African project brought, Crossing Borders brought, was the realisation that the discourse which focused on the creative work, which had primarily been about technical issues, about how to do this or how to do that, moved into a cultural dimension, that there was much more discussion about language itself, what English meant to an African, whose English it was. A lot of the old post-colonial questions about ownership of language surfaced. The use of indigenous languages, African languages, Luganda or Sepedi in South Africa, what did it mean to insert those words into that text which was still ductile and which the tutor could still interact? What was the significance of the insertion of those kind of linguistic hotspots from other languages? And more it became apparent that wrapped around the creative work was an intercultural discourse about the nature of being alive, about the nature of using English, about the nature of colonial and post-colonial dislocation. Bearing in mind that many of our mentors here in the UK have been selected because they were from culturally diverse backgrounds. So we had a whole exchange between the contemporary multicultural Britain, a word I don't like very much, and this kind of curious post-colonial situation in Africa where, ironically, curricula had ossified. We left our curriculum in the 1950s in Africa, and then we developed a vibrant multicultural society here, leaving them with an ossified kind of remnant of empire. And that was the kind of thing we were trying to work away at. We began to build ever adventurous new websites at Lancaster to represent the work of what had become a kind of small phalanx of people interested in changing the perception of Lancaster University. And it seemed to me that Lancaster University no longer has to be located in physical space. There's a sense in which this university now can become a virtual entity, and in a sense can exist anywhere, can almost orbit the planet through its satellite connections. And what we wanted to do was to break out of this kind of rather stifling sense that we were within an English department, within a geographically isolated university, and to open up the idea that literature is about crossing cultural boundaries. And by cultural, it could be how we do things in our house, in our town, in our country. And within Africa, we'd also had a very dynamic intercultural exchange between countries. So we were on the verge of this extraordinary excitement about what it's like to write in English, and for that writing to travel. It's the excitement that I'd seen in seminar groups where we had students from Canada, we had students from Greece, students from Sweden interacting with kind of native-born speakers, as it were. But that was taken place into a context in which our exchanges were permanent. So unlike the transitory exchange that we're having now, most of which you're forgetting, there was a permanent record for this process. And the relationship built up between every tutor and every student became a portfolio of original research that could be revisited at any point in the course. So as a teacher, I saw absolutely invaluable pedagogic advantages to this process of using a text-based pedagogic medium. Kind of time rolled on and we dug a tunnel out of the English department and set up our own centre, which is the Centre for Transcultural Writing and Research, which kind of yoked together a number of research projects, including one in Manchester here with migrant writing, a number of projects in Africa, and some new projects that we're instigating. Well, the idea was to give a web presence and a focus to this work. And a very curious thing began to happen. First of all, the assumption that we ran an e-learning PhD was invented by inquirers, by potential students. It had been at the back of my mind, but it was so outrageous, I thought that I'd never get it past colleagues in the department. But people began to tell us that this is what we should be doing. Increasing pressure on creative writing as a discipline to adopt more formal practice in terms of its research training. We've got a very, the PhD program at Lancaster has grown from 3 students to 18 students in 4 years. And we get a lot of inquiries now from PhD students. And the pressure that accompanied this was to provide the kind of academic context which was comparable with other academic disciplines, so research training methodology. Because we ran a distance learning MA, the research training methodology had to be online. We couldn't deliver it in any other way. As soon as we put the research training methodology online, the e-learning PhD was invented. We had all we needed to launch the PhD through a virtual learning environment. Plus, a kind of bombardment of applications that were not just from outside Lancaster, but from outside the UK, increasingly outside Europe, and increasingly focused on transcultural issues. So the content of the research proposals that began to come towards us began to embody some of the ideas about the exchange of language and literature between cultures that have kind of developed at the core of the centre. So the centre has been what Edward O. Wilson would call a self-assembling organism, as if from the primal soup of Lancaster University, a bolt of lightning struck, and through the expectations of students out there throughout the world, and through our kind of interesting, and I guess just tunnelling away from what I felt was a bit of a set piece in the English department to some possibility that seemed to be out there. We now have this suite of e-learning programs. The distance learning PhD is now pretty well established. The Centre for Transcultural Writing and Research is a piece of sand in the oyster of the faculty. We're hoping that someone will see its potential for international recruitment. So for me, one of the huge pluses of e-learning in terms of reaching a consistency of students is its social inclusiveness. And we've also had disabled students able to do our courses. We've had women who are in domestic circumstances where they have commitments that have been able to do it. We have people who simply live a long way from anywhere who've been able to do those courses. And the interaction, all of those seem to be aspects of culture as well. Those interactions have hugely enriched the processes of those courses where we have conferences, and often the debates and discussions about literature and writing are about aspects of culture as well. So it seems that we've embedded this sense of what it is to be human and what it is to be part of the human community into this process of actually developing creative writing itself. I think I'll stop there. That sounds great, actually, doesn't it? The reason we called I won't stop there, Chris. The reason we called this spinning the web was that that in many ways, you know, we're working in a situation that is inimical to some of the things that we're doing. Clearly people don't like other colleagues' empire building, you know, what are they up to in there? And especially if you're caught laughing in a room together, people are immediately suspicious that you might be enjoying yourself and doing something worthwhile. It seems to be the tyranny of the RAE, which is, you know, kind of moving past us now, and the emphasis on personal research, the lone scholar, is a real problem in universities that are also supposed to be, you know, moving towards research projects and research outputs. One of the things that I'm very interested in now is this notion of what is research and creative writing. You know, the argument that poetry itself is a valid form of research output seems to me, you know, still to be in a balance. But for me, someone who's developed some of major projects, in what sense is a project with all its democratic interactions, its textual outputs? Crossing Borders is still out there in textual form. The whole tissue of that project that happened in 8 countries between 325 people is all stored away in archives. And in 50 years' time will be an extraordinary discussion between the UK as a sort of emerging multicultural society and Africa, which is trying to emerge from the post-colonial situation, all vectored through this process of developing new literature there. But I suppose one of the key issues we've got is how do we persuade other people that any of this is worthwhile when they're so locked into their personal research? How do we, I guess, make the connection that teaching doesn't drain you of your creative potential, but it can actually reinforce that? And I think my experience of e-learning, because it's about literary craft, because as much kind of aesthetic energy goes into creating a well-crafted report on a student's work as writing a poem, it seems to me that there are connections at every single level between this process of working as a writer in the creative sense and working as a writer in the creative educational sense. So I feel that there's a continuum there that's certainly brought me rewards as a writer. But it's very difficult to say that to other people, especially if your eyes come on like 60-watt light bulbs. People seem to back away from the whole technological process. And I think people adhere to this romantic notion still that there's something dangerous about the creative kind of flux inside us. You know, Locke's idea of duende, that dark, passionate force that rises up. But it just seems to me that technology enables that, and it actually enables it in the most extraordinary way to travel, you know, in the way that we want all literature to travel. So we tried to create this link between the use of web space to project our courses, and I guess the last thing I want to say is the way we've focused on how do we get people interested. And the answer, yet again, has been found in our student constituency. We've begun to profile students on the websites. We've featured their narratives of their experience. And we've featured, in a very simple way, photographs of African writers. And those have had an immediate visual impact on inquirers that come to us. You know, the culture of the intercultural context has been dramatised by just pictures of people, actually, that are part of our student constituency. And we've got them to talk about their experience, and you couldn't make it up really, because they're all writers and they all write wonderfully redemptive stories about how they joined the course, how terrible it was, and then how brilliant when they got through the bad patch to the position that they're in now, which is to have left the course behind. And increasingly, those narratives are coming in from across the English-speaking world. So this is I guess this notion that the web is being spun, but not actually by us, but by our constituency as well. Sorry if I remember that.